Larry Summers has been ringing the alarm over inflation for quite some time now. And to be quite frank, he is not the most articulate when it comes to expressing his views on the economy. I disagree with him on many issues pertaining to the economy. But one of the things that he said recently that was clunky to say the least was that, look, in order to combat inflation, we just need to increase unemployment. Now keep in mind, this is after the American people heard over and over again that their unemployment benefits needed to be taken away from them prematurely to essentially make them so desperate that they'd be forced back into the job market. But now all of a sudden, you're hearing calls for a higher unemployment rate in order to tackle inflation. So how does this all work? Well, first let's get to his statements and then I'll break it down for you. So he says during a speech in London, we need 5 years of unemployment above 5% to contain inflation. In other words, we need 2 years of 7.5% unemployment, or 5 years of 6% unemployment, or 1 year of 10% unemployment. There are numbers that are remarkably discouraging relative to the Federal Reserve view. Okay, so the Federal Reserve is really key here, right? Because what he is specifically talking about is how the economy, it's hot. The economy is too hot. Too many ordinary people have too much cash in their pockets. That's really like the thought process that this man is going through, completely ignoring the fact that Americans are being price gouged by corporations that are making record profits. But let's put that aside for now. His argument is, listen, there's limited supply, there's too much demand, and what we need is for the Federal Reserve to intervene and lower the demand, meaning lower the purchasing power of ordinary people. And a good way of doing that, of course, is unemployment. Now, it's really unclear if he's calling for companies to just fire workers or if he is arguing that this will be the inevitable outcome of the Federal Reserve increasing interest rates. Even though I'm unsure of what he specifically means, let's be clear that the Federal Reserve raising interest rates absolutely will increase unemployment, and I'll explain how in just a moment. The rest of his comment. The gap between 7.5% unemployment for 2 years and 4.1% unemployment for 1 year is immense. Is our central bank prepared to do what is necessary to stabilize inflation if something like what I've estimated is necessary? So I think we get a little more clarity there where he's essentially arguing, look, we need the Federal Reserve to increase interest rates and to do so aggressively. And to be sure, the Federal Reserve has increased interest rates. And I think that that is the right way to go. And I'll explain why, because it does have a downside for ordinary working Americans. But if we actually had a Congress, if we had a government, rather than this unelected group of people in the Federal Reserve making decisions about how to make people whole in an economic downturn, we would be in much better shape. But the Federal Reserve engaging in incredibly low interest rates, essentially easy money for corporations, for banks, for private equity firms, that has led to inflation specifically of assets. So you look at the stock market, we have had an incredibly long run of the stock market just doing really well. There was a little bit of a downturn, not a little bit, there was a crash in the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. But what did the Federal Reserve do? They came in and they used a monetary policy known as quantitative easing, something I've talked about on the show before, where they essentially buy stocks, bonds, assets to provide liquidity for these corporations, for these banks. Essentially, it's easy money for these corporations, for these banks, for these companies. And what did they do with that money? What is the thinking behind it? Well, you give them more liquidity, and the thought is the economy will keep chugging along, chugging along, chugging along. What ended up happening with that money was the wealthy took it and they invested in themselves. And they got even richer. So when you see inflation in our housing market, yes, it is partly caused by the low inventory of homes available for ordinary Americans to buy. And then that has a domino effect. It impacts the rental market because there's an increased demand for rentals from individuals who can't afford to buy homes. Private equity firms took the money from the Federal Reserve And they bought up entire neighborhoods of homes at a time when we're having a housing crisis because of limited inventory. So raising interest rates, I think, is absolutely necessary. You also had the issue of corporations taking the easy money and doing corporate stock buybacks, record corporate stock buybacks, thus artificially inflating the value of shares for their company in the stock market, okay? So there is a bubble everywhere, right? You see a bubble in the housing market. It's different from the bubble we experienced in 2008. There is a bubble, artificially inflated stock values in our stock market. And eventually the market is gonna have to correct itself. You can't continue doing this because if you just allow the economy to chug along, not based on the fundamentals of these companies and how they're performing, but rather the manipulation of money, eventually this house of cards will come crashing down. But there is a downside for ordinary Americans, and I wanna talk about that because that is in this system, ordinary Americans can't win. And part of the problem is Congress deciding to hand over these responsibilities to the Federal Reserve so they don't have to do their jobs, they don't have to make difficult decisions about regulations, like let's say banning companies from doing corporate stock buybacks or putting regulations in place that would prevent private equity firms from snatching up available homes in the real estate market. They are unwilling to do that hard work. So instead, they turn it over to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve has very, very limited tools in its toolbox, if you will, right? So they can do very little when it comes to inflation. And so I wanna go to this next video because Jerome Powell explains exactly why he is increasing interest rates, and I'll talk about the impact it will have on unemployment in America. Let's watch.
Chair Powell, you said last week that interest rate increases, quote, moderate demand. Can you just explain a little more about what that means?
Sure. So we think about interest rate increases as affecting financial conditions and then the economy through three broad channels. The first of which is interest-sensitive spending. So that's durable goods and automobiles and things like that. So interest rates go up, people's demand for, as a result of higher interest rates will moderate or decline so that supply and demand can get into better balance. The second channel is just asset prices generally. Interest rates, as they go up, will cause asset prices to moderate across the economy, and people spend a little bit less out of their lower level of wealth.
So again, the whole point here is we want to limit the amount of income or the demand for products because the economy is too hot. And that, of course, is overwhelmingly going to impact normal working people, okay? Average working people. So to give you those details, since March, when the Fed first started raising interest rates with a modest 25 to 50 basis point target range, the Dow has fallen 12%, the S&P has fallen 16%, and the NASDAQ has fallen 20%. Part of the reason why is because that house of cards starts to come crashing down once corporations don't have access to that easy money thanks to the Fed's monetary policy of providing that easy money, okay? But what tends to happen to companies when, remember, they have a fiduciary responsibility to return or provide a return of investment to their shareholders. That's the whole point. That's how this market system works, right? So what are they gonna end up doing? Well, they're probably gonna end up cutting jobs so they can maximize profits. Or if you have less ordinary people being able to buy things within the economy, there's gonna be less demand, and some companies might even go under, and there might be unemployment as a result of that. So at this point, there seems to be a consensus that we are entering a recession, okay? So the question is, if you do have the Federal Reserve raising interest rates, and it will have a negative impact on ordinary workers, what would the solution be? A solution that would adjust the artificial, values that we see in the stock market, that would help with the housing crisis that we have now without hurting ordinary Americans. Well, I'm worried that the ship has kind of sailed, right? Because there are robust social safety nets in other countries, so when you enter a recession, there's something in place to prevent people from being homeless, from suffering, from not being able to feed their families. There's something for them to fall back on. In the United States, we don't have that. And that is a huge problem. We should have had a system in place that, in the very least, regulated the housing market to make sure that these goons weren't buying up the limited inventory of homes to then become, to be monopolized slumlords in this country. Ship has sailed on that, okay? The Fed's monetary policy was disastrous. So Larry Summers is right about that, as much as I hate to admit it. I disagree with him on a lot of things. Easy money is not good for the economy because it overwhelmingly benefits the rich and it increases the gap in wealth between the rich and the poor, okay? And you can see how that exploded after the 2008 economic collapse when the Federal Reserve really engaged in quantitative easing. But Summers repeated his prior calls that the Fed's task of tempering price gains is similar in scale to that of former Chair Paul Volcker, who had to engineer a deep recession and double-digit unemployment 40 years ago to get inflation under control. When the Fed pushed interest rates to double-digit levels in the early 1980s in an effort to bring down rapid inflation, it set off brutal back-to-back recessions that pushed the unemployment rate to nearly 11%. Look, we're talking about tens of millions of Americans who will lose their livelihoods as a result of this. And we have no social safety net in place. And I mean, it's hard to point to the specific issue here because it's just the failure of our feckless elected lawmakers who refuse to pursue the right regulations in the very least, but also decided to withdraw from their own duties and have unelected people make decisions about interest rates as if that is the only thing that would help keep the economy healthy. The Fed has done the exact opposite of that. So it's not just a question of where we are in this very moment. It's a question of whether or not we're going to fully reform a system that always puts ordinary people at a massive disadvantage. That is what we're experiencing right now. Larry Summers just thinks, well, this is what the system calls for. Yeah, there's pain and suffering for ordinary people, tens of millions of working Americans, but this is how the system works. Nothing we can do about it, except there is. The system doesn't have to work this way. I'm not in favor of the rich having access to easy money, which screws us over further. So I again agree with what the Federal Reserve is doing, but there should be a lot more done, including, by the way, the Biden administration using the Wars Power Act to, not the Wars Power Act, but essentially using its power to unilaterally ramp up production and manufacturing of items we need within our borders. He could do that, right? And he could also call out the corporations that are currently price gouging us, because that's a huge part of the inflation issue that gets ignored in the press. In fact, I'm gonna read two things and then we'll wrap this up. A new paper published Tuesday, and I apologize guys, this is a graphic from a different story, but it's relevant for this. A new paper published Tuesday shows US corporate price markups and profits surged to their highest levels since the 1950s. So what the authors over at the Roosevelt Institute found was that the difference between the actual cost of a good or service and the selling price were both the highest level on record and the largest one-year increase in 2021. How high companies can increase their sales up and above their cost matters for the economy more generally because these markups distribute economic gains from workers and consumers to firms and shareholders. This is especially the case when almost 100% of these firms' earnings derive from markups and distributed upward to shareholders rather than retained and reinvested. So you have corporations price gouging us. Okay, you have insane manipulation in our financialized, capitalist system by the people at the very top to ensure that they make themselves richer and they take advantage and exploit every type of economic downturn to their advantage. They do it over and over again. And to hear Larry Summers say, well, we need to just accept that unemployment is a part of this and sad day for you, I don't accept that. We could have a better system in place, but I don't really see a single lawmaker advocating for that today.